The stars had always called to humanity, and finally they answered back. Commander Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the Endeavour and watched the alien ship approach through the viewing screen. It was beautiful in a way that made his chest tighten with something between wonder and fear. The vessel looked like it was made of liquid silver and light, moving through space as if swimming through water rather than the cold vacuum between worlds. After 200 years of searching and 50 years of trying, humanity had finally built a ship that could travel faster than light, and on their very first voyage beyond Earth's solar system, they had found exactly what they were looking for, or perhaps what had been looking for them. The alien's message had been clear and had arrived in perfect English, which was the first thing that made the hair on the back of Morrison's neck stand up. They called themselves the Galactic Council, and said they had been waiting for humanity to join the community of starfaring species. They spoke of friendship and cooperation and all the wonders that awaited Earth among the stars. They invited Commander Morrison to bring his ship and delegation to their capital station for a formal welcome ceremony. It was everything humanity had dreamed of, which was exactly why Morrison's instincts were screaming at him that something was wrong. Back on Earth, President Helen Crawford sat in the Situation Room deep beneath the White House and listened to the Joint Chiefs argue about the alien invitation. General Paul Stevens, a man who had spent 40 years in military intelligence and had the suspicious mind to prove it, spread holographic images across the conference table. The alien ship had appeared exactly 3 days after the Endeavour completed its first faster-than-light jump. Not 3 weeks or 3 months, but 3 days. As if they had been waiting and watching for Earth to reach this exact milestone. Admiral Lisa Grant leaned forward in her chair and pointed at the tactical display. She had commanded submarines before moving to space operations and had learned to trust her gut when something felt off. The alien ship had superior technology in every measurable way, yet they approached slowly and peacefully, making no aggressive moves. That could mean they were genuinely friendly, or it could mean they were so confident in their superiority that they saw no need to hurry. Either way, humanity was dealing with a civilization that had been traveling the stars for far longer than humans had been building cities. The president listened to both sides of the debate and felt the weight of 8 billion lives pressing down on her shoulders. Half her advisors wanted to welcome the aliens with open arms and accept their offer of friendship and technology. The other half wanted to turn the Endeavour around and pretend humanity never figured out faster than light travel in the first place. Both sides had good points, and both sides scared her for different reasons. She made her decision and gave her orders, and 12 hours later, Commander Morrison received his instructions. He would accept the alien invitation and travel to their capital station. He would be diplomatic and friendly, and represent the best of what humanity had to offer. And he would also be very, very careful, because President Crawford had not survived 30 years in politics by taking strangers at their word, especially strangers with spaceships that could probably vaporize Earth from orbit if they wanted to. The alien who called himself Velkara materialized on the Endeavour's Bridge 3, days into their journey to the Council's capital. He appeared as a pillar of crystal that somehow moved and spoke, his voice coming through the ship's speakers in that same perfect English that made Morrison's skin crawl. Velkara spoke of the wonders awaiting humanity and the thousands of species that made up the Council. He mentioned almost casually that Earth would need to complete something called the Integration Protocol. Just a formality, really. Nothing to worry about. He explained it so smoothly that Morrison almost missed the important part buried in all the friendly words. The Integration Protocol meant that Earth's military would become part of the Council's peacekeeping forces. It meant Earth's defensive networks would link into the Council's systems for coordination and efficiency. It meant pooling resources and technology for the greater good of all member species. Velkara made it sound like joining a neighborhood association. All cooperation and mutual benefit. Morrison smiled and nodded and asked intelligent questions while his communications officer, Lieutenant Amy Rogers, quietly recorded every word and ran it through analysis programs. She was young but brilliant, and she had the kind of mind that saw patterns others missed. 3 hours after Velkara departed, she came to Morrison's quarters with a report that confirmed his worst suspicions. The Integration Protocol was not a partnership agreement. It was a surrender document dressed up in pretty words. Any species that signed it would be giving up control of their military, their defenses, and their ability to say no to anything the Council demanded. Rogers had analyzed similar agreements in human history, from corporate mergers to political annexations, and the pattern was always the same. One side had all the power and the other side had none, and no amount of friendly language changed that basic fact. Morrison took the report to his senior staff and watched their faces change as they read through the details. Major Kevin Palmer, who commanded the Endeavor's Marine Detachment, was the first to speak. He was a practical man who had fought in 3 different conflicts before joining the space program, and he knew a trap when he saw one. The aliens were offering humanity a choice between submission or isolation, and they were doing it with smiles and promises of friendship. But here was the thing about humanity that the Galactic Council did not understand. Humans had been paranoid about aliens since before they left Earth's atmosphere. Every movie and book and video game had prepared them for exactly this scenario. Friendly aliens with hidden agendas, peaceful invitations that turned into cages, promises of utopia that became prisons. Humanity had imagined every possible first contact scenario and planned for all of them, which was why, when the Endeavor left Earth 3 weeks ago, it did not leave alone. General Stevens activated something called Protocol Midnight from his office in Colorado. The order went out on channels that did not officially exist to facilities that were not on any public record. Deep under mountains and beneath oceans, in places that would make conspiracy theorists feel vindicated, humanity's real space fleet began to wake up. These were ships that had been built in secret over the past 20 years by people who understood that hope for the best meant nothing without preparing for the worst. The Endeavor and its 11 companion ships were humanity's public face, clean and diplomatic, and representing Earth's official first contact mission. The other 300 vessels waiting in the dark were humanity's insurance policy, and they were about to prove that sometimes paranoia was just good planning. Commander Morrison continued toward the alien capital station with his crew in their dress uniforms and their best diplomatic smiles. He would attend the ceremony and be polite and give the Galactic Council exactly what they expected to see, which was a primitive species eager to join the community of advanced civilizations. What the Council would not see until it was too late was that humanity had learned long ago to never walk into a room without knowing where all the exits were, and they never accepted an invitation without having a backup plan. The aliens thought they were setting a trap, but they had made one critical mistake. They assumed humanity would come unprepared. Nexus Prime was larger than anything humanity had ever built, and more beautiful than anything they had ever imagined. The station stretched across space like a small moon made of light and metal, with towers that reached up toward nothing and gardens that somehow grew in the vacuum. Ships from 1,000 worlds filled the space around it like a swarm of metallic insects, each one different from the last, each one representing a species that had joined the Galactic Council. Commander Jake Morrison guided the Endeavor into its assigned docking berth with steady hands that did not show the tension running through his body. His crew wore their dress uniforms and had their best diplomatic faces on, smiling and waving for the cameras that broadcast their arrival to billions of watching aliens across the galaxy. Below decks, Major Kevin Palmer and his Marines checked their weapons for what felt like the 1,000th time, their dress uniforms hiding body armor and the kind of equipment that official diplomatic missions were not supposed to carry. The docking clamps engaged with a sound that rang through the hull like a prison door closing, and Morrison took a deep breath before standing to meet their hosts. Lieutenant Amy Rogers caught his eye from her station and gave him the smallest nod, which meant her equipment was ready and recording everything. Whatever happened next, Earth would have a record of it. Velkara met them at the airlock with what might have been a smile if crystal beings could smile. The alien's body caught the station's light and threw it back in colors that did not have names in any human language. Beside Velkara stood High Chancellor Thexlar, the leader of the Galactic Council, and Morrison had to force himself not to step back at the sight of the massive insectoid creature. Thexlar was easily 3 meters tall with a chitinous shell that gleamed like polished obsidian, and mandibles that could probably bite through steel. The translator device hanging, in the air between them turned the Chancellor's clicking and buzzing into smooth English words of welcome. They were given a tour of the station that felt like walking through a dream. Gardens grew under the light of artificial suns that hung in enclosed spaces the size of city blocks. Markets stretched for kilometers where beings traded goods from worlds Morrison had never heard of and probably could not pronounce. There were species that looked like walking plants and others that seemed to be made of living fire. There were beings that floated through the air on invisible currents and others that scuttled along the walls on too many legs. It was everything humanity had hoped first contact would be, which made Morrison trust it even less. Lieutenant Rogers walked beside him and kept her eyes moving, cataloging everything she saw. Her uniform concealed sensors that were busy mapping the station's layout and analyzing its systems. She noticed things that the aliens probably thought were too subtle for primitive humans to catch. The security checkpoints they passed were not just scanning for weapons, but were taking detailed biological readings of every human in the group. The cameras watching them were not just recording for posterity, but were building psychological profiles based on how the humans reacted to different stimuli. Every step of this tour was designed to gather information, and Rogers made sure that information flowed both ways. The ceremony took place in the Grand Council chamber, a space so vast that Morrison could barely see the far walls. Representatives from all 200 and 47 member species filled the seats in a display that was clearly meant to overwhelm the primitive humans with the scale and power of the organization they were joining. High Chancellor Thexlar stood at the center of it all, his voice amplified to fill the enormous room as he began the integration speech. The Chancellor spoke of unity and cooperation, and the peace that the Council had maintained for 10,000 cycles. He talked about the wisdom of working together and the dangers of species trying to survive alone in a hostile galaxy. His words painted a picture of a perfect civilization, where every species contributed their unique strengths, and everyone benefited from the collective knowledge and resources of the Council. It was a beautiful vision, and Morrison did not believe a word of it. President Helen Crawford appeared as a hologram beside Morrison, her image transmitted from Earth through quantum communication that the aliens could not jam or intercept. She wore her most formal suit and her most diplomatic expression as she prepared to give Earth's official acceptance of the integration protocol. The council chamber fell silent as every being present waited to hear humanity agree to join their perfect system. Then the trap snapped, shut with a speed that would have been impressive if Morrison had not been expecting it. Energy fields erupted across the station like invisible walls slamming into place. Every human ship docked at Nexus Prime found itself caught in a web of force that killed their engines and locked down their weapons. The Endeavor and its 11 companions were suddenly nothing more than expensive coffins floating in space. Throughout the station, bulkheads dropped and sealed, separating the human delegation into small isolated groups. Armed drones emerged from hidden compartments in the walls, their weapons trained on the suddenly vulnerable humans who had walked so trustingly into the Council's home. High Chancellor Thexler's mandibles spread wide in what the translator helpfully identified as satisfaction and amusement. His voice lost its warm diplomatic tone and became something colder and more honest. He explained that Morrison had misunderstood the nature of the invitation. Humanity was not being asked to join the Council as equals. They were being processed as the newest addition to the Council's collection of domesticated species. Velkara's crystalline form pulsed with colors that the translator turned into words of patient explanation. Every species that discovered faster than light travel received the same invitation. Those who accepted were integrated into the Council's system, their military forces dismantled, their populations catalogued, and assigned roles based on their biological capabilities. Those who refused were quarantined on their homeworld with orbital blockades that prevented them from ever reaching the stars again. Either way, the Council maintained its monopoly on interstellar civilization and ensured that no new species could ever challenge their authority. The Chancellor activated holographic displays that showed hundreds of species who had gone through this exact same process. Some had accepted immediately and were now productive members of the Council's empire. Others had resisted and were destroyed or imprisoned on their worlds until they died out naturally. The message was clear and brutal in its simplicity. Submit or be eliminated. There was no third option because the Council had spent 30,000 years making sure no third option existed. Thexlar turned his attention to President Crawford's hologram and informed her that Earth's defenses were currently being neutralized by a Council fleet that had been waiting in Earth's solar system for the past 3 weeks. Resistance was pointless because humanity numbered only 8 billion, while the Council commanded trillions. The smart choice was to accept integration and allow human civilization to survive in a diminished but continuing form. The alternative was planetary sterilization and the complete erasure of humanity from the galaxy. Morrison looked at the weapons pointed at his crew and thought about Earth and its defenses, being torn apart by ships they never saw coming. He thought about 8 billion people who trusted their leaders to protect them and keep them safe. He thought about the dreams of 1,000 generations, who looked up at the stars and wondered what was out there. Then he smiled. The expression on his face made Velkara's crystal structure flicker with colors that the translator identified as confusion and concern. Morrison reached up and tapped his communication badge with a casual gesture that seemed absurdly calm, given the circumstances. His voice was steady as he spoke words that had been planned for months and rehearsed 100 times. He told General Stevens that the aliens had taken the bait. Stevens' response came through clear and strong despite all the dampening fields and jammers the aliens had activated. The general's voice carried the satisfaction of a man whose paranoid planning had just been vindicated. He confirmed Morrison's message and gave the order to initiate something called Ghost Protocol. Throughout Nexus Prime, human prisoners stopped looking afraid and started looking dangerous. Their smiles spread like a virus as they watched their captors begin to realize that something had gone very wrong with their perfect trap. And across the galaxy, in positions the Council had never detected and around worlds they thought were secure, humanity's real fleet dropped out of stealth mode and showed the Galactic Council what happened when you tried to trap a species that had spent 2 centuries preparing for exactly this moment. Admiral Lisa Grant stood on the bridge of the Washington and watched her tactical display light up with 300 green icons as humanity's hidden fleet revealed itself across Council space. Each icon represented a warship that had been built in secret over the past 20 years, constructed in facilities that did not exist on any official record by workers who understood that sometimes the best defense was the one nobody knew about. The Galactic Council had been watching Earth's public broadcasts and congratulating themselves on how easy it would be to integrate this primitive species. They had not noticed the encrypted quantum channels carrying real orders or the ships that had been moving into position. For the past 3 weeks, Captain Gary Brooks stood at the tactical station and reported that all ships had successfully reached their assigned positions without being detected. 300 human vessels now floated in optimal firing positions around 200 Council worlds, having spent days creeping through space under stealth systems that the aliens did not know existed. The Council had sophisticated sensors that could detect energy signatures from halfway across a solar system, so humanity had built ships that ran cold and silent, using minimal power and moving at speeds that looked like random debris on any scanner. Grant gave the order to execute Operation Thunderclap, and across the galaxy, human weapons spoke with a voice that the Council had never heard before. The aliens had spent millennia perfecting energy weapons that required massive power generators and complex targeting systems. Humanity had perfected something much simpler and far more terrifying. They had learned to throw rocks very, very fast. Mass drivers accelerated tungsten rods to relativistic speeds, turning simple metal into kinetic weapons that hit with the force of nuclear explosions. Council defense stations designed to intimidate primitive species with energy shields and laser batteries died before they could even charge their weapons. The shields that could deflect particle beams and absorb plasma were worthless against solid matter moving at a significant fraction of light speed. Orbital platforms that had kept hundreds of species imprisoned on their homeworlds shattered into debris clouds that would burn in their planets' atmospheres for weeks. The Council's military had grown comfortable over thousands of years of facing no real opposition. Their weapons were elegant and their tactics were designed for showing overwhelming force to make resistance seem pointless. They had never fought an enemy that understood modern warfare, because they had never allowed any species to develop the technology to fight back. Humanity had developed that technology in secret and had spent 2 centuries thinking about nothing but how to fight a war against a superior alien force. Back on Nexus Prime, Commander Jake Morrison watched the alien guards react to the sudden flood of emergency alerts coming through their communication systems. Their weapons wavered as they tried to understand reports that made no sense. How could a primitive species that had just developed faster than light travel have hundreds of ships attacking Council worlds simultaneously? How could their defense stations be dying when the humans had no energy weapons that should be able to penetrate their shields. Lieutenant Amy Rogers sat at her station and smiled as the malware she had been planting in Council systems for the past 3 weeks activated all at once. The aliens had been so busy scanning humans for weapons and biological threats that they had not paid attention to the digital infiltration happening right under their sensors. Every time a human touched a computer interface or walked past a data terminal, Rogers and her team had been mapping networks and planting code that waited patiently for the right signal. That signal had just been sent, and now Council computer systems across the galaxy were turning against their masters. Major Kevin Palmer moved before the alien guards could decide what to do. His combat knife, a simple piece of sharpened steel that the sophisticated alien scanners had dismissed as a primitive ceremonial object, took the nearest guard in the throat before it could pull its trigger. His Marines followed his lead with the kind of speed and precision that came from training for this exact moment, since the day they enlisted. The aliens had superior technology and sophisticated weapons, but they had never developed the close combat, skills that humans had perfected through thousands of years of killing each other. The Council chamber descended into chaos as 247 species watched their carefully planned integration ceremony turn into a battle. Palmer and his team moved through the confusion with brutal efficiency, taking down guards and securing positions while minimizing casualties. Morrison had been clear in his orders. They were not here to commit genocide or to prove humanity was the toughest species in the galaxy. They were here to break a system that had been enslaving civilizations for 30,000 years. Commander Morrison stood over High Chancellor Thexelar as the massive insectoid leader struggled against the paralysis field that Palmer's team had hit him with. The translator still worked, turning the Chancellor's confused clicking into words that expressed disbelief and confusion. Thexelar insisted that what was happening was impossible. Human technology was primitive, and their fleet was limited to the 12 ships they had. Brought to Nexus Prime, there was no way they could have built and hidden hundreds of warships without the Council knowing about it. Morrison knelt down so he was at eye level with the fallen Chancellor and explained that humanity had exactly the fleet they wanted the Council to see. Did the aliens really think that Earth would send its only ships into unknown space without backup plans and contingency protocols? Humanity had been paranoid about alien invasion since before they reached their own moon. They had spent 100 years imagining every possible first contact scenario and another 50 years building the weapons and ships to deal with the bad outcomes. Velkara's crystalline form pulsed with colors that the translator identified as desperate pleading. The alien insisted that the Council commanded trillions of beings across thousands of worlds, while humanity was only 8 billion people on one planet. The numbers made victory impossible even if humans had surprised them with hidden ships. The Council would mobilize its full military and crush Earth within months. Morrison smiled again and asked General Stevens for a status report. The general's voice came through clearly now that human malware had taken control of the station's communication systems. Stevens reported that every Council communication network was currently under human control. The faster-than-light relay system that connected the Council's empire had been seized by human hackers who had spent 3 weeks learning its access codes. Individual worlds had no idea they were under attack because humanity was controlling exactly what information they received. As far as 90% of the Council's population knew, everything was perfectly normal and another primitive species was being peacefully integrated. President Helen Crawford's hologram flickered back into view as the alien jammers failed and quantum communication was restored. She looked at the captured Council leadership with an expression that mixed disappointment and determination. The President informed Chancellor Thexelar that humanity needed to renegotiate the terms of their membership in the galactic community. The old terms where Earth surrendered its sovereignty and accepted domestication were no longer acceptable. New terms would need to be discussed, and those terms would be negotiated between equals rather than between master and slave. Admiral Grant reported that her fleet had successfully seized control of orbital infrastructure around every major council world without firing a single shot at civilian targets. Human ships now controlled the space gates that allowed faster-than-light travel between systems. They held the communication relays that connected the Empire. They commanded the high ground above worlds that had not fought a war in thousands of years and had no idea how to start. In less than 4 hours, Humanity had decapitated the largest government in galactic history through a combination of careful planning, ruthless execution, and the element of surprise. The trap had been perfect in its design and flawless in its execution. The Galactic Council had refined this process over 30,000 years and had never failed to capture an emerging species. They had anticipated every possible response from acceptance to resistance and had contingency plans for all of them. What they had not anticipated was a species that spent its entire history preparing for threats that did not exist yet. They had not planned for a civilization that built weapons in secret and rehearsed battles against imaginary enemies. They had not understood that human paranoia was not a weakness to be exploited, but a survival trait that had kept the species alive through ice ages and wars and disasters that would have ended softer civilizations. The Galactic Council had tried to trap humanity with an offer too good to refuse and a threat too terrible to resist, but humanity had been waiting for them with a response too devastating to survive, and a plan too subtle to detect until it was already too late. The galaxy would never underestimate Earth again. The interrogations lasted 3 days and revealed a truth that made Commander Jake Morrison wish they had never left Earth. He sat across from council officials, who had once held power over trillions of beings, and listened to them explain 30,000 years of carefully orchestrated cultural genocide. The Galactic Council was not 10,000 cycles old as they claimed in their public histories. It was 3 times that age, and it had not grown through peaceful diplomacy and voluntary cooperation. It had grown by finding species when they were most vulnerable and offering them a choice between slavery and death. Dr. Elizabeth Moore, humanity's chief xenoanthropologist, compiled the data from hundreds of interviews and thousands of recovered files. She was a woman who had spent her career studying how cultures evolved and died, but nothing in her academic experience had prepared her for the scale of what the Council had done. 247 member species, and not one of them had retained its original government or military or cultural independence. The Council had not conquered these civilizations in the traditional sense. They had done something far more insidious. They had convinced each species that surrender was salvation. The system was elegant in its cruelty. Every species that reached the stars received the invitation. Those who accepted had their military forces absorbed into the Council's peacekeeping fleet within the first year. Their governments were restructured to match Council standards. Their education systems were redesigned to teach Council history and Council values. Within 3 generations, the children of integrated species could not remember that their ancestors had ever been independent. The Council controlled what was taught in schools and what was shown in media, and what history was considered truth. They rewrote the past until their subjects believed they had always been part of the Empire and could not imagine any other existence. General Paul Stevens reviewed the files on species that had refused integration, and what he found made his blood run cold. 17 civilizations had rejected the Council's offer over the past 30,000 years. 15 of them had been quarantined on their homeworlds with orbital blockades that prevented any ship from leaving or entering their space. The Council did not destroy these species directly. They simply trapped them on their planets and waited. Without access to resources from other worlds or the ability to expand beyond their single planet, every one of those 15 civilizations had eventually torn itself apart through resource wars, or environmental collapse or nuclear conflict. The Council would then remove the blockade and catalog the dead world as a tragic example of what happened when species refused enlightened guidance. The other 2, species that refused integration, had been deemed too aggressive to contain safely. Their worlds had been sterilized completely, every living thing burned away until nothing remained but radioactive rock. The Council now used those dead planets as nature preserves where member species could go on vacation and contemplate the dangers of excessive independence. The message was clear to every civilization in Council space: accept integration or accept extinction. Major Kevin Palmer stood in the holding area where they were keeping captured Council officials and tried to determine if these beings were victims or perpetrators. Many of them seemed genuinely confused by humanity's resistance. They could not understand why Earth would reject the benefits of membership, or why humans saw integration as a threat rather than an opportunity. These aliens had been raised from birth in a system that taught them independence was dangerous, and freedom led to chaos and war. They looked at humans the way a parent might look at a child playing with a loaded weapon, certain that intervention was necessary to prevent disaster. Lieutenant Amy Rogers spent days analyzing the psychological conditioning that the Council used on its member species. She found layers of subtle manipulation that started in childhood and continued throughout each being's life. The education system taught that the Council had saved the galaxy from itself by eliminating the possibility of interstellar war. The media constantly reinforced the message that individual species were too flawed and too aggressive to be trusted with sovereignty. The government structure ensured that anyone who questioned the system was identified early and re-educated before their doubts could spread. It was a perfect prison built not from walls and bars but from ideas and beliefs that made escape seem unthinkable. President Helen Crawford stood in the Oval Office and looked at Earth through her window while contemplating an impossible situation. Humanity had control of the Council's infrastructure and had successfully prevented any organized military response. 300 human ships held the high ground over the most important worlds in the galaxy, but they were 8 billion people trying to manage an empire of trillions, and that was not a sustainable position. They could not hold the galaxy by force, and even if they could, that would make them no better than the Council they had just defeated. Admiral Lisa Grant proposed a solution that was both simple and terrifying in its implications. They would not hold the Empire. They would break it. Humanity would use its control of Council communication systems to broadcast the truth to every member species. They would show the real history of integration and reveal the manipulation that had kept civilizations enslaved for thousands of years. They would give every species the information they needed to make their own choice about freedom. And then they would step back and let the galaxy decide its own future. Over the next week, human ships began transmitting across Council space on every frequency and through every communication channel. The broadcasts contained the true history of the Galactic Council, including the records of species that had been integrated against their will. They showed the psychological conditioning programs and the cultural extinction protocols. They revealed the fates of civilizations that had refused integration and the brutal calculus that made submission seem like the only rational choice. Most importantly, they broadcast the actual code of the integration protocol itself, the hidden programming that turned independent species into obedient members of the Empire. The reaction was not immediate, because the Council had spent 30,000 years perfecting social control. Most member species initially rejected the broadcasts as human propaganda or lies designed to sow chaos. The Council's conditioning ran deep, and breaking through decades of education and belief was not something that could be done with a single message. But the humans were patient and persistent. They kept broadcasting the truth and backing it up with evidence that came from the Council's own archives. They showed member species their own forgotten histories and let them see what their ancestors had looked like before integration. The first species to break away from the Council were the Karathi, a feline race that had retained more cultural memory than most. Their homeworld declared independence and shut down Council access to their computer systems. Within days, 7 more species followed their example, then 20, then hundreds. The careful order that the Council had maintained for 30,000 years began to fracture as species that had been integrated generations ago started remembering what freedom meant. The Galactic Council did not collapse all at once. It fragmented slowly and painfully as member species made different choices about their futures. Some declared immediate independence and began the difficult process of rebuilding their own governments. Others panicked at the thought of self-governance and begged the Council to maintain order. Still others erupted into civil war as different factions fought over whether to embrace freedom or cling to the security of the old system. Commander Morrison watched the chaos spread across the galaxy and understood that humanity had unleashed something that could not be controlled or contained. They had broken the cage that held hundreds of civilizations prisoner, but breaking a cage did not automatically teach anyone how to be free. Some species would thrive with independence. Others would struggle and fail. Many would make terrible mistakes as they learned to govern themselves, and humanity would stand at the center of it all, trying desperately to prevent the galaxy from tearing itself apart. In the aftermath of liberation, they had won the war against the Council in 4 hours. The peace that followed would take decades or centuries to build, and there was no guarantee it would succeed. President Crawford addressed the United Nations and acknowledged the difficult truth that freedom was not a gift humanity could give to other species. It was a choice each civilization had to make for themselves, with all the risks and responsibilities that choice entailed. Earth had broken the Council's control, but what came next would be determined by every species in the galaxy, making their own decisions about how to live. The trap had been sprung, and the prisoners were free. But freedom turned out to be far more complicated than anyone had imagined. 6 months after the counterstrike, Commander Jake Morrison stood on the observation deck of what used to be called Nexus Prime and watched ships from 87 different species arrive for the first meeting of what they were calling the Free Worlds Coalition. The station had been renamed Unity Station, a symbolic gesture that marked the end of centralized control and the beginning of something new. Morrison had been promoted to admiral and given command of humanity's diplomatic fleet, which meant he spent his days trying to prevent species that had been prisoners together from killing each other, now that they were free. Earth had not sought to replace the Galactic Council with a new empire. President Helen Crawford had been absolutely clear from the beginning that humanity did not want to rule the galaxy. They wanted to prevent anyone from ruling it, but preventing tyranny turned out to be far more complicated than defeating it. And the past 6 months had taught humanity some hard lessons about the difference between winning a war and building a peace. Admiral Lisa Grant coordinated the most complex military operation in human history, and it had nothing to do with fighting. Her fleet was scattered across 200 worlds trying to manage the peaceful withdrawal of Council forces from planets that wanted independence. Some species had made the transition smoothly, establishing new governments and taking control of their own defenses without major problems. Others had descended into chaos the moment the Council's authority was removed, with different factions fighting for power and old grievances erupting into violence. After being suppressed for generations, the worst cases were the species that had been integrated so thoroughly that they could not function without the Council's direction. These civilizations had lost the ability to govern themselves over thousands of years of dependence. When humanity removed the Council's control, entire planetary governments collapsed because nobody remembered how to make decisions without asking permission from a higher authority. Grant found herself in the uncomfortable position of having to protect remnants of the Council's administration. On some worlds, because removing them too quickly would cause more harm than leaving them in place. General Paul Stevens worked with representatives from 60 species to establish new frameworks for interstellar cooperation. They could not simply recreate the Council under a different name, because the fundamental problem was centralized authority that could be corrupted over time. Instead, they were building a network of treaties and mutual agreements where each species retained full sovereignty. It was messy and inefficient and required endless negotiations over details that the Council had simply mandated from above. But it was also the first genuinely democratic structure the galaxy had seen in 30,000 years, and Stevens believed it was worth the difficulty. Dr. Elizabeth Moore spent her days helping species recover their lost histories and cultural identities. The Council had been very thorough in erasing the past, and many civilizations had only fragments of knowledge about what their ancestors had been like before integration. Moore and her team of researchers dug through Council archives to find records that had been deliberately hidden or destroyed. They helped species relearn their own languages and traditions and ways of thinking that had been systematically eliminated over generations. It was slow work with no guarantee of success. But every culture they helped recover was a small victory against the Council's legacy of extinction. Major Kevin Palmer commanded human peacekeeping forces that were trying to prevent the worst atrocities as the old order collapsed. His Marines had gone from fighting to save humanity to fighting to save species they barely understood from destroying each other in the chaos of liberation. Palmer had thought war was difficult, but he was learning that peace was harder. In war, you knew who the enemy was and what you were trying to accomplish. In peace, everyone was potentially both friend and enemy, and success was measured in small steps rather than decisive victories. Lieutenant Amy Rogers led teams of programmers helping individual species reclaim their computer networks from Council control. Every civilization had different technology and unique needs, which meant there was no simple solution that worked for everyone. Rogers had to customize each approach to match the species she was helping, teaching them to secure their own systems while being careful not to create new dependencies. The goal was to make each species self-sufficient rather than replacing council control with human control. But that required patience and careful teaching that took far longer than simply doing the work herself. On Earth, President Crawford faced her own challenges as humanity debated what role they should play in the galaxy's future. Many humans believed their species should leverage their military advantage to establish a new empire that would be more benevolent than the Council, but still centralized under human leadership. They argued that the galaxy needed strong guidance to prevent chaos, and that humanity had proven itself capable of providing that guidance. Others wanted to withdraw entirely, to seal Earth's borders and ignore the mess they had created by destroying the Council's authority. They insisted that humanity had no obligation to fix problems for alien species and that getting involved in galactic politics would only drain Earth's resources. Crawford rejected both extremes and chose a third path that satisfied nobody completely but seemed like the only responsible option. She told the United Nations that humanity had not fought for freedom, just to abandon it when freedom proved difficult. The galaxy was in turmoil because humans had broken the system that kept it stable, which meant they had a moral obligation to help build something better. But they could not and would not impose their values on everyone else, because that would make them no better than the council they had defeated. Instead, Earth would be an example. They would show that a species could be powerful without being tyrannical. They would prove that democracy could work even when it was messy and inefficient. They would stand ready to help any civilization that chose freedom, but they would not force that choice on anyone. Crawford knew this approach would be criticized from all sides, but she believed it was the only way to honor the principles they claimed to defend. 12 months after first contact, the galaxy had changed beyond recognition. The Galactic Council still existed in a reduced form, consisting of species that genuinely preferred the old system and were free to maintain it as long as they did not force it on others. 193 species had declared independence and were struggling through the difficult process of learning to govern themselves. 17 had immediately gone to war with neighbors over territorial disputes and old grievances that the Council had suppressed. 42 had established functioning democracies. 38 had created new authoritarian governments that were different from the Council, but still centralized and controlling. It was not perfect, and would never be perfect, but it was free. Admiral Morrison stood in the Council chamber where the trap had been sprung and watched representatives from dozens of species argue over the terms of mutual defense treaties. A Korathi ambassador named Kira approached him during a break in the negotiations. Her feline features showed a mixture of gratitude and curiosity, as she asked why humanity had chosen to save other species without conquering them. Most civilizations, given the power Earth wielded, would have used it to establish their own empire. Morrison thought about Earth's long history of empires that had risen and fallen. He thought about the wars humanity had fought over ideology and resources. He thought about the mistakes they had made and the lessons they had learned through centuries of struggle. He explained that humans understood the cost of both tyranny and freedom because they had experienced both throughout their history. They knew that you could not force enlightenment on anyone. You could only create conditions where it might grow. The coalition meeting resumed, and Morrison listened to species that had once been subjects of an empire negotiate as equals. Some would succeed in building stable societies. Some would fail and face terrible consequences. Many would struggle for generations before finding their path. But they would all do it freely, making their own choices and living with their own mistakes. The Galactic Council had tried to trap humanity with an offer of partnership that was really slavery. They had not known that humans had been expecting exactly this scenario since they first looked at the stars and imagined what might be waiting there. They had prepared for the trap and sprung a counter-trap that broke an empire in hours. Now humanity was learning that breaking chains was the easy part. Teaching species to walk as free beings after 30,000 years of captivity would take patience and wisdom and time. The galaxy would never be the same, and neither would humanity. They had won the war. Now came the harder battle of building a peace worth winning.